Good afternoon. My name is Greg Krasovsky. I'm a Russian-American attorney. Today is Wednesday, March 9th, and this video is devoted to legal help, emergency help, to Americans and their loved ones, their families in Russia. A little bit earlier today, the U.S. Embassy held a town meeting, virtual town meeting on the web, explaining to Americans of the services that they can provide in the situation that they face in Russia today. This was made in follow-up to the announcement made by the State Department and the U.S. Embassy on March 5th, issuing a level 4, threat notice and a recommendation for all Americans to immediately depart Russia. This is as serious as it gets. Obviously, this has been made to follow up or in response to the Russian military operation in Ukraine or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, as the U.S. ambassador properly pointed out, the relationship between the United States and Russia is at an all-time low. Probably, as bad as it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, if that's any consolation. But let's think about what this means and the legal help that you need. If you're an American citizen or a green card holder, and you've decided to follow our embassy's advice and depart Russia, first you're facing logistical issues. As you know, there are travel restrictions. EU and American airspace has been restricted to, it does not permit Russian airlines. Russia has issued reciprocal restrictions. So for all practical purposes, what this means is that there's a limited number of flights out of Russia if you're going to travel by air. Other options of leaving Russia are by train or by car. In some cases also by ship. So you have to explore all your options. You also have to consider the current COVID-19 restrictions that are still in place in certain places that require pre-trip COVID-19 PCR test results. Some countries still require COVID-19 vaccinations and vaccination certificates or QR codes. But getting back to the U.S., as the U.S. Embassy staff pointed out during the town hall meeting, the Centers for Disease Control has suspended pre-flight requirements, if I'm not mistaken, up to April 1st. So just get on a plane and fly to the U.S., even if you don't have a PCR test. But when it comes to various airlines, they are likely to require you to have negative COVID-19 test results within 24 or 48 hours of boarding the plane or being permitted to register to board the plane. So make sure you comply with those. In terms of tickets, one of the issues that has come up, if you can find tickets through various hubs that are still being used by airlines coming in and out of Russia, for instance, Istanbul in Turkey or the Emirates or other places. Obviously, you can use third countries that are not a part of the EU to schedule to plan your trip. If you're only, and then remember, when you schedule a trip, you also have to consider whether there are visa requirements for American citizens or green card holders, or whether you'll be permitted a transit visa. So our advice to you is, check into all this. Follow up with the airlines. If necessary, look at the websites of the country. The country in question's border service, their customs service, to make sure you're in compliance with all applicable, basically border control regulations and customs regulations, as well as I said, the COVID requirements. If you're having trouble buying a ticket out of Russia, and you may, because right now, aside from U.S. and EU government sanctions, we also have private sector sanctions involving Russian banks being subject to sanctions, and people can't make bank transfers. Visa and MasterCard have also stopped operations or international acceptance of Russian-issued cards, and vice versa. For instance, Visa and MasterCards issued by foreign banks, you can't use them in Russia anymore or withdraw money. Haven't personally tried it, but that's what I've been told. So if you're having issues buying tickets, then give us a call and we'll go through what's possible for you. Also consider talking to your friends and relatives abroad to see if they're willing to order the ticket for you. And then you can, compensate them upon arrival. Also be mindful of currency control regulations when you try to take cash out of Russia, because Russia has recently passed regulations limiting the amount of money you can take out of Russia, I think up to $10,000. You're not going to be able to take more than $10,000 in cash with you. This also relates to being able to transfer money abroad. So if you're not sure what's happening and you can't get a clear answer from your banking institutions, including the banks that have issued your debit or credit cards, or you think they may not have properly understood the scope and the depth of the sanctions, then contact my law offices and we'll try to figure out what's what and give you the proper legal advice. But a more important issue that people are facing is an issue concerning their family members or loved ones who do not have travel documents that would permit them entry into the U.S. In other words, either a U.S. passport, a green card, or a valid visa, whether it's an immigrant visa or a non-immigrant visa or a travel document. If you're planning to leave Russia and you have to take your spouse, your Russian spouse, or a spouse from another country, or children who do not have American citizenship or are not lawful permanent residents or green card holders, then what you really need to do is see whether you're able to organize expedited review of a petition for an alien relative, or the expedited consular processing of a petition that's already been completed. As you know, when you apply for your alien relatives to receive an immigrant visa, you submit a petition to USCIS in the U.S. In certain circumstances, you can submit this petition to the U.S. Embassy in the country where you're residing. Once that petition has been approved, it gets transferred over to the National Visa Center. This is a U.S. State Department entity that makes sure that you submit all the appropriate supporting documents, birth certificates, passports, marriage certificates, for instance, tax returns for your affidavit of support, that you also, as I said, civil documents such as your marriage certificate. Once you've submitted all of this, then the National Visa Service, once they've examined everything, you also need to fill out an extensive DS-260 form, which is basically the online visa form. Once you've submitted everything, your visa gets transferred for consular processing to the embassy that's going to issue the immigrant visa. Because of the diplomatic spat between Russia and the United States, the U.S. Embassy in Russia hasn't been dealing with immigrant visas, or especially non-immigrant visas, for a while, due to a shortage of staff. Regarding Ukraine, well, we know what's happening in Ukraine. The U.S. Embassy has been evacuated. Right now, the country is a war zone, or at least certain parts of it. That's not an option. Before, people would obtain visas in places like Warsaw, some people even in Moldova, as in Chisinau. Other people had applied for visas, I know, in Kazakhstan, in Prague, in the Czech Republic. We've had clients who've received visas in Israel, other places. But today, what I would really recommend you do is make sure you go to the U.S. Embassy's website. Make sure you go to the State Department's website. Look at what they have. Also make sure that after you viewed the websites, if necessary, you can make the phone calls if you have access, and you can make phone calls to the State Department in the U.S., necessarily the National Visa Center, or even USCIS. You have to be prepared for extremely long wait times while you're listening to the on-hold music, but you have no choice. because your options of getting your loved ones into the United States are as follows. And listen, this is not specific legal advice. Any competent, experienced attorney is going to tell you, before we can give you legal advice that's relevant, specific, and appropriate to your particular case, we have to evaluate, examine all the legal facts involving your particular situation. General legal advice is like general medical advice. You know, you could read about it online, but you should never engage in self-treatment or rely on it. So, just as a disclaimer, this is for information purposes only. If you really want, legal advice or legal representation, then you have to become a client of either my law office or another attorney who's competent in immigration law, and execute a retainer letter or sign a legal services agreement, and then we can work with you once we've determined your particular situation. But in general, like I've said, look at the U.S. Embassy's websites. The embassy in Moscow, the embassy, for instance, in Frankfurt, Germany, that's right now processing lots of applications that are coming in from Ukrainian refugees or Americans in Ukraine and their loved ones. Or other embassies, for instance, in the country that you plan to travel to before you go to the U.S., if that's an option for you. Once you've looked at all the relevant websites, like I've said, also look at the State Department website. You can go to our law office's website. We have lists of categories of visas that are available and visas that we can help you with. But today, what you really need to look at and apply for is expedited processing, because you want your petition for an alien relative to be reviewed in an expedited manner, given the potential harm and danger that could befall your family and you, if you're staying in Russia, if you're basically evaluating your risk based on U.S. Embassy risk assessment and recommendations. You can also ask for expedited processing at the National Visa Center, or expedited consular processing once your visa is at the relevant embassy. The other option that's available to you, if you have what are called emergent conditions and valid humanitarian reasons, is humanitarian parole. And this is at the discretion of Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Patrol. This is something that you need to apply for with USCIS, or you can also apply to the State Department. But what this means is your loved one who's not a U.S. citizen, in emergencies, for humanitarian reasons, could be given a travel document that permits them entry to the U.S. And this is called overseas parole or port of entry parole. And that determination, once your parole request is approved, and this is something you have to apply with USCIS, or you could also petition, request the State Department to petition for you. It's more complicated, and it's only made in certain circumstances. Overseas parole is also granted based on petitions from U.S. law enforcement agencies or even the U.S. intelligence community in particular cases where the individual that needs to be admitted to the U.S. is of importance, let's say, to an ongoing investigation, a witness or a cooperating witness or a confidential informant or someone who's aiding and assisting U.S. national or government interests. But for regular family stuff, you're looking at humanitarian parole based on, the pain and suffering, the emotional hardship that, having your family separated will cause you, or if you're a U.S. citizen and, you can't leave Russia because you can't leave your wife, your children behind, you're pretty much being held hostage here until you can take your family with you. Or if your family's separated, for instance, the U.S. citizen, the father or the wife, the husband or the wife could be in the U.S. while some of their family members are still in Russia, and the separation is causing hardship. So these are some of the grounds. My recommendation is, if you're going to apply for expedited processing, or if you're going to apply for humanitarian parole, overseas parole, or port of entry parole, then you should really seek the advice of an experienced and competent immigration attorney, so we can put together the accompanying letter explaining your circumstances. Also go through the circumstances with you and to make sure that these circumstances are sufficient for you to be granted humanitarian parole. Make sure that you get all your supporting documents in order as quickly as possible. Birth certificates, marriage certificates, passports, translations of birth and marriage certificates, of other relevant civil documents such as divorce decrees. If you have the opportunity to get the apostille, that's great too, because that means those documents will now be accepted as valid government documents in other countries that are signatories to the Hague Convention. So you can use those. In order to submit documents to the State Department or in its embassies or USCIS, you're going to need translations made by professional translators who can, vouch for their authenticity and are also competent to translate from one language into another, from Russian into English or whatever. So it's important to get that stuff together. If you have issues, for instance, concerning adoptions or stepchildren, and you need to prove your parental rights to these minors, take care of that. If there's an ongoing custody dispute, for instance, you're an American citizen, a husband or a wife who married a Russian national or a national of another former Soviet country, former Soviet republic, and your current spouse is still in a custody dispute with their previous spouse or the father or mother, the parent of their children, who are going to be your stepchildren now, you need to take care of that as well. And feel free to reach out to us, because one of the things that my office does is we specialize in international family law. So we can help you in that area. That's just having the appropriate legal basis to be able to take a minor child with you, or to have a minor child be granted certain immigration benefits, because this is a child over whom you have parental rights and who's residing with you. Aside from family law, probably the scariest and the most important thing that you have to consider is the personal safety of your family. In times of conflict, including military conflict and political conflict, you always get crazies, people who just don't act rationally and who will could take out their frustration on you. So if, as an American citizen, green card holder, or the loved one or family member of one, you're starting to be harassed, you're being harassed in Russia, or you're threatening persecution, or you're being threatened with prosecution, then make sure, obviously, you need to do three things. Number one, as I always say, put your friends and loved ones on notice of what's happening. So in the event you disappear, you're detained, anything else, then people know what happened to you and they can contact someone who can help. Second thing is, obviously, reach out to the U.S. Embassy or the State Department. During the town hall meeting, one of the most important things I was mentioned is make sure you're in the U.S. Embassy database of Americans in Russia, so they have your relevant information. Phone numbers, email addresses, U.S. passport photos or numbers, and people they can contact with emergency contacts in the U.S. Aside from contacting loved ones in the U.S. Embassy, contact a lawyer, my office or anyone else, to make sure that we can defend your legal rights to the full extent permitted by American law, Russian law, or the law of any other applicable jurisdiction where you happen to be. And we will also help you to get in touch with and make sure that your complaints are properly processed by local law enforcement. And that's important, because you don't want to be facing by yourself, working with local law enforcement who may not be particularly friendly to you, if they, for whatever reason, they blame your country for what's happening, which is inappropriate, but let's face it, things like this happen. So we pray for the best, but we have to be prepared for the worst. If you're being threatened by, colleagues, neighbors, acquaintances, business associates, counterparties, whoever, because of your American citizenship status, permanent residency, or affiliation with an American loved one or an American business, contact us, and we'll try to explain to these people that what they're doing is not just inappropriate, but also illegal. And if necessary, we're going to take appropriate legal action against them, whether it's a civil lawsuit or filing criminal complaints, so they can be held responsible for violations of local criminal or administrative laws. Safety and health, number one. If you don't pay attention to threats, you think they're minor or people are just bluffing, you're risking something, you're risking a potential catastrophe if people do, fulfill those threats. So it's better to err on the side of caution and try to get help right away. Aside from all the immigration issues, we've discussed logistics with airplanes, we've also discussed immigration issues, and we've discussed personal safety. The other thing that we need to discuss are just financial and legal consequences of having to depart quickly. If you have property, you may need to store it, to give it to someone for safeguarding, if necessary. Also execute legal agreements where someone is responsible for the storage of your property, especially if it's for remuneration, in other words, you're compensating them. If you're going to sell property, same thing, especially higher-end valuable items such as real estate, cars, other expensive equipment. Let's make sure you don't get ripped off. There's also going to be an issue of how you get paid, how you get the money out of Russia, if you need it outside of Russia. If you have certain obligations, for instance, you're a tenant, you're renting an apartment, a house, or you're renting office space, or industrial, commercial, retail space, and you believe you're entitled to early termination of your lease because of these force majeure circumstances, or you're just simply giving your landlord proper notice that's listed in your lease agreement, whether it's 30 days or whatever, reach out to us. Let's go through all your options. If you're entitled to use the force majeure clause in your contract, then that's how you should proceed. If we believe that the force majeure is not going to be enforceable the way it's worded, because at the end of the day, the military action in the war is not taking place in Russia, right? It's taking place abroad. But depending on how your force majeure clause is worded. So we need to make sure that anything you rely on is going to withstand any particular, within not just legal scrutiny, but litigation and adjudication in a court of law. In the event you can't find a mutually acceptable solution to this with your counterparties. So aside from leasing agreements, you may have employment obligations, either as an employee or as an employer. If you have to let employees go, give them severance pay, advance notice, things like that, recommendation letters, maybe they're entitled to some sort of an exit, bonus or profit share or whatever. Let's just make sure that we do everything correctly so you're not facing judgments against you in Russia down the road that could potentially be enforced in the U.S. And trust me, Russian judgments can be enforced in the U.S. depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the judgment. There are limited grounds to object to the domestication of foreign judgments. So don't just think if you've left Russia that everything that has happened ends in Russia. No, it can follow you to the U.S. If you're an employee and you have to leave, let's make sure you get paid. Let's make sure that you give your employer proper notice, things like that. And like I've said, if you're in the middle of, if you're going to be involved in sales purchase transactions, either as the seller or purchaser. Legal guidance is always helpful to make sure you don't get ripped off, and the due diligence is conducted properly. That's extremely important, especially where you're in a high-stress environment and you need to concentrate on other things like logistics of leaving. So it's useful to have legal representation and legal support, aside from accounting support. Tax issues also come up. What if you have tax obligations in Russia? What about your tax obligations in the U.S.? It's already tax season. As expats, we get a 2-year extension to file taxes. 2-month extension past the April 15th deadline. But you also have foreign bank account reporting requirements and other things. All these things need to be considered, and we'll gladly help you with those. So, just to reiterate and go through the list again, make sure you've looked at logistics of leaving this place. Make sure you look at all the immigration issues. If you need help with obtaining permits for your loved ones to travel to the U.S., and you can't do this on your own, usually dealing with immigration law on your own can be a disaster. So if you can afford it, contact an immigration attorney, either my law office or someone else. We do have some limited opportunities to provide pro bono legal services to people who are in dire need on a limited basis, because all of us have to feed our families and pay the bills. Aside from that, let's make sure that we deal with any property issues or any contractual obligations that you have in Russia. Another thing that comes up is, what if there's already a judgment against you in Russia over a civil matter? You owe someone money, or you didn't pay fines, traffic fines, or other administrative fines. And because of that judgment, your ability to leave Russia has been temporarily suspended, and the Federal Bailiff Service does this in conjunction with Russia's border service. And this is applicable not just to American citizens and green card holders, but to Russian citizens as well. And you say, well, I'd like to leave, but I'm prohibited from leaving Russia. Then you definitely better give us a call so we can go through your case, and if necessarily talk to the Federal Bailiff Service, the bailiff that's handling your case. And if necessary, reach out to your judgment creditors to make sure these issues are resolved. Because you may have everything on track in terms of airline ticket logistics and the ability to enter the U.S. or an EU country or wherever you decide to leave Russia for. But if you haven't resolved the issue of having the legal right to leave Russia, you can get stuck here until that's cleared up. And you don't want to say, well, let's see if I can make it. Because what you'll end up doing is just wasting money on plane tickets that you may not be able to exchange for another date or get a refund on. And we regularly get phone calls from people who try to leave Russia and they're stopped at the border, once they reach border control, passport control, and the border service guard says, no, you're in the database, you're not allowed to leave. And often, most of these people had an idea that there may be a restriction on leaving Russia on them, but they never dealt with it, or they chose to ignore it. So let's not let it come to that, because that's extremely important. Again, as I've said before, safety is number one. So if you feel you're being threatened, then by anyone, in whatever manner, whether it's harassment, people are making terroristic threats or insults, then call us so we can protect your legal rights and put an end to it with the assistance of local law enforcement and with the assistance of the court system if necessary. That's about it. Here's what I really want to reiterate. In a situation like this, make sure don't think that you're in this on your own. You need to have a support network, but you also need to remember that there are people who are willing to help you. So don't be shy about reaching out to friends, family, people you may not even, been in touch with for a while, colleagues, neighbors. Always reach out, if necessary, to the U.S. Embassy and the State Department. They're there to help American citizens and lawful permanent residents. That's their job. And they're good at doing their job, within their mission parameters and within their staffing. So don't forget to do that. And also realize that you can always reach out to a lawyer, an attorney like me, and we'll try to give you advice. Even if you don't have money to pay for our legal services, we can figure something out for you. But you're not alone. So, don't get depressed, don't get frustrated, and think that there's no way out. Have a support network. The good news at the end of this video is as follows. Hopefully, whatever is happening will come to an end. Hopefully, issues will be resolved. Let's not panic and think that, we're going to have a war with NATO next week or a potential nuclear conflict. That's not going to help anything. No one is interested who's in their right mind in starting World War III, because there will be no winners, right? As they say, with the exception of cockroaches and other wildlife that'll survive, right? Nuclear winter and everything else. So I don't think it's going to come to that. Yes, we have issues of economic sanctions, but look, more importantly, we have issues of loss of life. So if we're going to do something, and you want to do something that's going to help you with your depression, give us a call. We'll help you get involved in nonprofit efforts to help people who have been hurt by this conflict in Ukraine. People are being displaced. People are being hurt by indiscriminate shelling. People are being hurt by used as live shields when combatants decide to use residential neighborhoods for their military activities or to hide out. It's never a good idea when you start using residential housing or apartment buildings as something that's going to shelter you from enemy fire or give you a position from which you can, attack the enemy. This is all bad news. But in war, you end up having war crimes. So we're not going to get involved in, who's responsible for what. The most important thing is people need help. And if you feel that, you're dealing with depression, give us a call. We'll put you in touch with organizations, nonprofits, volunteer organizations that are helping people, helping to get them out of harm's way in terms of evacuations, providing them with necessities that they need, food, water, blankets, shelter, things like that. Also helping children adjust psychologically, which is extremely important. And I think that'll definitely improve your mood, okay? But you're not alone. We're all going to go through this. And politics are politics, but people are people. And what Ambassador Sullivan properly pointed out is that usually Americans do not have issues with Russians, and Russians do not have issues with Americans. Most Russians that I know like Americans, and most Americans that I know like Russians. So this is an issue of politics. But people are always willing to help each other because, we're not the ones calling the shots and causing these issues. But unfortunately, we're the ones who have to deal with the fallout and the consequences. So let's get together and just, as people, help each other. And we're here to help you out as well. Thank you. Like I said, anything comes up, feel free to call me, and we'll put you in touch with people who can help you, or we'll try to help you ourselves. Take care.